Hello and welcome to one and all. So in today's class, we will see about the land reforms in India. In the previous class, we have discussed about, I explained to you about the uh, what are all the measures that have to be taken to increase the productivity in Indian agriculture. So going on that line, the first reforms that government has undertaken is in the area of institutional reforms, in the area of that is called as the land reforms. So why that has to be taken by the government was because at the time of independence, the landowner and the tenant, the owner and the tenant, the relationship that was very, very defective. It was feudal in nature, or in other words, which this system uh, was again introduced by the British. So at the time of independence, the land owner, that is the owner of the land, and the tenant, who is actually the cultivator. So the cultivator, that relationship was defective. So that time there were mainly three principal groups operating on land. Groups operating on land. The first one was a proprietor. They are the owners. So were the landowners. The second group consisted of the tenants. So the tenants are the one who take the land on lease from the owners, and they are the cultivators. They were the working cultivators. And the third one happens to be the agricultural laborers. So the third category, they were the ones who are, hired by the tenants to work in that piece of land. They are all the landless agricultural laborers. And that this finally what is happening, only these two are actually practically these people were the tenants, and the agricultural laborers were practically operating on the land, and the proprietor, the owner, being absent from the piece of land, which is called as the absentee landlordism. The problem was the tenants and the agricultural laborers, they are not interested in improving the productivity of the land, and also they are not ignorant, and they are not aware of any modern methods. And the owner, he is interested only in collecting the rent from the tenant periodically. He was also not interested in improving the production or productivity, or whatever the problems, whatever the improvements that have to be undertaken in the land to increase the productivity. He was also not bothered about it. And these tenants and agricultural laborers, anyway, they're pathetic. They don't have any asset or anything, and they don't have any knowledge. And finally, what happened? The agricultural productivity in the country were very, very low. Okay, very, very poor productivity, and the total production was very, very low in the country. So in order to rectify this mistake, to bring out a better man-land relations, the government of India introduced the land reforms. So basically, land reforms is introduced. So the land reforms were implemented after independence by the government to rectify the defective man-land relations in the form of landowners, tenants, and the agricultural laborers, and most importantly, to redistribute the land to small and marginal farmers and also to landless households. So this was the main aim of land reforms. Okay. So having this kind of aim, what were all the objectives of land reforms in the country? Okay. So when the government introduced the land reforms in the country, the government had certain objectives. So those objectives, so the first and foremost is protection of the tenants from exploitation. So the tenants were subjected to several kinds of exploitation from the landowners. Basically, like that rent was not fixed at, at the will and wish of the owner. The rents were frequently hiked by the owner, and they did not have any security. Anytime the tenant might be asked to vacate the land. So, like that, so many defects were there. The tenants were subjected to several forms of exploitation. So, in order to protect the tenants from all forms of exploitation, that was one of the objectives of land reforms. Then the second one is the second objective was removal of the structural impediments in agrarian structure which was inherited from the past. Okay, the basic agricultural structure is not favorable to increase the productivity in agriculture, and that was inherited from the past. Inherited from the past in the sense that right from the time the Britishers started ruling in our country, so that kind of the agricultural system structure was being operated like that. So what is that structure? What is that agricultural structure? Just now I mentioned to you, isn't it? The man land relations was not conducive, was not favorable, it was defective. The absentee landlordism, the owner being absent, he was interested only in collecting the revenue from the tenant, and the tenant and the agricultural laborers, they were subjected to all forms of exploitation. So they were not interested in increasing the productivity of land. So this was the kind of agricultural structure that was prevailing in our country. So that agricultural structure is acting as an impediment, acting as an obstacle for the development of agriculture in our country. So that kind of structural impediments, that those kinds of obstacles have to be removed by the government through the implementation of land reforms. Okay. Then the third one is the provision of security of tenure to the tiller of the soil. Who is the tiller of the soil? The one who is actually cultivating, that is the tenants. So those tenants have to be provided the security. So security in the sense that they should not be evicted at any time the owner wants. So they should be given that granted the security so that they will be working with more enthusiasm, with more interest in that same piece of land. So if a person is not having, the tenant is not having any security, if he's constantly under the fear of that anytime the landlord might remove me from this land, he will not be able to work with so much interest and enthusiasm. He will not be bothering to make any improvements in that piece of land, isn't it? So in order to rectify that, the government one of the land reform measures the government initiated is to provide the security of tenure to the tenant. Okay. Then the fourth objective was assurance of equality of status. Equality of status and opportunity to all sections of rural population. So that is the reason the land, this one, redistributing the land to the small and marginal and farmers and also to landless households. So that if everybody is having a certain kind of asset, there will be equality in status. And with that amount of, with that area of land, they will be having that income earning opportunity. So all sections of rural population. Then the next objective was provision of land ownership to the weaker sections of the rural society. So that is the ultimate aim, distributing the surplus land to the uh, small and marginal farmers and also to landless laborers and giving them the ownership rights. Okay, weaker sections of the society. So if the land is, if they are made the owners of the land, they will work with more and more enthusiasm, isn't it? Ultimately, the productivity will increase. Sections of the rural society. Then the next one is improvement in the agricultural production through land reclamation. So land reclamation means there are certain areas which are not very fertile, which are almost dry land. But some scientific methods have to be adopted so that those land could also be put into use, because whatever the available land, if you consider only the fertile land in the country, that will not be sufficient to distribute to all the sections of the population in the country. I mean, all the rural sections of the population who don't have any land or having a very very small pieces of land, so it is not sufficient. So whatever the land that lying as waste because they were considered as dry or barren or something, those land could also be brought into cultivation by adopting some kind of scientific technique. Okay, that is land reclamation. So through that, the production, agricultural production overall in the country will increase. So that is the next measure. Then establishment of direct relationship between the government and real cultivators. So this objective was mainly because during the British rule, there were several intermediaries between the government and the actual cultivators. So which created so many problems. So the government was not aware of whatever the problems that were being faced by the tenants. So in order to avoid that, so there should be, without any intermediary, there should be a direct connection between the government and the tenants, so that the government will, the tenants, the real cultivators, they can voice their problems and the government can take steps to solve all those problems accordingly, so that there should not be any intermediary. There should be only a direct relationship between the government and the actual cultivators. Then basically it is abolishing of all the intermediaries. Then the next one is the rational use of scarce land resources. So this is just, if land reforms were implemented, it will lead to proper, without any wastage, there will be a proper use of the scarce land resources in the country. And redistribution of land to the rural poor. Okay, so this is the ultimate aim. So these were all the main objectives of land reforms in the country. Okay, so based on these objectives, the some of the land reform measures introduced by the by government of India was, which is the components of land reforms. So what were all the land reform measure introduced by the government based on the objectives? So the first one, what the government had undertaken was abolition of intermediaries. The second measure taken was introducing tenancy reforms. The third reform measure was imposing ceilings on land holdings. The fourth reform measure was consolidating the land holdings, that is consolidation of land holdings. And finally, cooperative farming. So these were all the main land reforms introduced by the government. Okay, so let us check out one by one what were all the features of each one of these reforms. So the first one was, the first land reform measure was abolition of intermediaries. So at the time during the British rule, they introduced three types of land tenure systems which were prevailing in our country. Okay, this was the at the time of it, three types of land tenure systems were prevailing. The first one was the zamindari system. So this zamindari system, this is actually, this was introduced by Lord. So this system was introduced by Lord Cornwallis in 1793. There was an act called as the Through the Permanent Settlement Act. So this was first introduced in Bengal, and later on it spread to other areas like Bihar, Orissa, and Varanasi. Okay, so this what basically this system was, the government appointed certain intermediaries known as the zamindars. So these intermediaries, they were supposed to collect the revenue from, or tax. So the tax from the farmers, and they are supposed to pay it to the British government. It is like they are acting like an intermediary. See, like it was like this. So on the top, you are having so here the British government, and the zamindars, and here the farmers, or they are called as the peasants, that is the farmers. So they were acting as an intermediary to collect the uh, tax or revenue from the farmers, and they are supposed to pay to the British government. So this is permanent settlement, and in the sense that these zamindars were appointed on a more or less on a permanent basis. So that's why it is called as the system is also called as the permanent revenue settlement system. So basically, these zamindars, they were actually the appointed, I mean, the intermediaries, and the ownership titles was given to this zamindars. Okay, so the ownership titles was given to the zamindars, and they are supposed to collect the rent or the tax from the farmers, and they are supposed to pay to the British government. So whatever the revenue that was collected, so the realized amount, I mean the realized tax or revenue amount collected was divided into 11 parts. Be divided into 11 parts. So out of this, 1/11 of the share that will go to the zamindars, and the remaining 10/11 to the East India Company. Okay, so this was the zamindari system, and this position, because since they got that ownership rights, they continuously they were exploiting the poor farmers. So anyway, this is the zamindari system. Okay, then the second system introduced was the right system. So in this right system, this was introduced by Thomas Munro in 1820. Okay, so this was basically in South India. First, it was introduced in Madras, and later it extended to Bombay, some parts of Assam, and Coorg. So basically, in this system, there were no intermediary. The ownership rights was given to the peasants only. So there are no intermediary here, and the peasants are directly responsible to pay the revenue to the government. Directly responsible to pay the tax to the government, to the British government. So that was the right system. But the problem here was the revenue rates. So the revenue rates were somewhere around 50% of the produce. The farmer has to pay almost 50% of whatever he has been cultivating in the form of tax or revenue to the British government. So 50% of the produce, if the land is dry, without any irrigation facilities, or if it's not that much fertile, he has to pay, the farmer has to pay 50% of the produce. Or otherwise, if the land is more fertile, or if it is having the irrigation facilities, then he has to pay 60% of the produce in irrigated lands. So you can understand that more than half the percentage of the produce he has to part with in the form of rent to the in the form of tax to the British government. And on the top of it, the rent is also not fixed, the tax is also not fixed. Frequently, the tax was increased, the rates of tax were increased by the British government. So even though there is a direct relation between the government and the farmer without any intermediary, the rates of tax was extremely high for the poor farmer. Okay. Then the third system was the Mahalbari system. So in this system was introduced by William Bentinck in 1833. So this was introduced in the areas of northwest frontiers, Agra, Punjab, Gangetic valleys, etc. So in this system, the land was divided into something called as a mahal, and each mahal comprises of uh, one or more villages, and the entire all the units of the villages are considered as one mahal, and the village head was appointed, and this village head uh, was acting as an intermediary, and he is supposed to collect the tax from the farmers and pay to the British government. And in this system also, the ownership rights were given to the tenants only, I mean to the rights to the peasants only. But in this system also, the tax charged by the government were extremely high. So all the three systems, they had their own problems, their own, the farmers faced their own difficulties. And in all the three systems, the tax charged by the government was extremely high. And even if there is any problem, if there is a drought condition or anything also, the farmer, they have to pay the required amount of rent, required amount of tax to the British government before the deadline. So if the farmers were not able to pay before the deadline, what will happen? They used to borrow. So they used to borrow from the money lenders, and they used to take loan from the money lenders against mortgaging their agricultural land. Okay, because they have to pay the rent or the tax to the government before the deadline. So those farmers, if they are not able to repay the loan along with the interest, those lands were eventually taken over by the money lenders. And most of the time, these money lenders happens to be the landowners, the same zamindars, the village head. They all happen to be the uh, lenders to the farmers. So finally, what happened? The majority of the farmers, they lost their land because of this system prevailing in the country at the time of independence. So after independence, the government abolished all these three types of intermediaries. Okay. So during the first 5-year plan, so that is between 1951 to 1960, the government abolished all these types of intermediaries. So that was the first main land reform measures the government had implemented. Okay. Then the second reform the government had undertaken is something called as the tenancy reforms. So the tenant, so who is a tenant? So the tenant is the actual cultivator, the actual cultivator, that is the farmer who is taking the land on lease for cultivation, land on lease from the owner. Okay, so again, at the time of independence, there were three types of tenants existing in the country. So one type of tenant is known as the occupancy tenants. So these occupancy tenants, they are more or like a permanent tenants. Like generation after generation, the same, it's based on inheritance. So generation after generation, the same family will be working as a tenants. So more or less they had, what you said, they had that permanency. Okay, their condition was slightly better. But then this occupancy tenants, because of that privilege, they started letting out, they started leasing out to other uh, tenants known as the subtenants. This is the second type of tenants, subtenants. And third one, the tenants at will. So these people are like a landless agricultural laborers. So the condition of these two subtenants and the tenants at will were very, very poor. Okay, so they did not have, very pathetic. They did not have any security, and there were frequent increase in the rates of rents. So all those exploitations were happening among the, among the subtenants and the tenants and will. Okay, so in order to avoid that, in order to rectify this mistake, the government introduced the tenancy reforms. So again, there were three types of tenancy reforms introduced by the government. So these were all the reforms. One is regulation of rent. So because what was happening, the owners, they were at their bill, they kept on increasing the rent. So the planning commission, they made a rule that what should be the maximum amount of rent that has to be charged. So they fixed a rent, that is the maximum rent that has to be paid. So that should not exceed 1/3 of the produce. So that means the owner should not charge more than 1/3 of the produce as the rent. And ideally, it ranges between 1/4 or 1/5, depending upon the fertility of the land, depending upon the availability of irrigation facilities, etc., etc. So it will be ranging between that, and maximum it should not go beyond 1/3 of the produce. So regulating, fixing the maximum amount of rent so that the owners cannot periodically keep on increasing the rents. Then the second measure is security of tenure. So if the owner is, see, if the cultivator is provided the security, he will work more enthusiastically, isn't it? So most of the governments, they passed their, enacted their several laws stating that landlords cannot eject tenants. They cannot remove the tenants as they like. That means as long as the tenants are paying the rent regularly, the landlords are not supposed to remove the tenants from that piece of land. Okay, so most of the time what the landlords were doing, they they say that they will ask the tenant to vacate the piece of land, saying that they need the land for self cultivation. See, it is like you are staying in a rented house. So when you are staying in a rented house, the owner can come and tell you to vacate that from that house anytime, isn't it? Same thing. So if the landlord cannot can come and tell the tenant, this is for my personal cultivation, you have to remove that piece of land. So under that pretext, the landlords cannot remove the tenant as long as they are paying the rent regularly, and even if it is for self cultivation, the some part of land should be, the landlord should not take the entire land. some part of the land should be retained with the tenant. The tenant should be allowed to cultivate a certain piece of land. Only the remaining part, the landlord can take it for personal cultivation. So that is the security of tenure. So if the security is provided, the tenants will be working with more enthusiasm, isn't it? And the third and ultimate measure is giving ownership rights to tenant. Ownership rights to tenants. So you must have heard the saying, the magic of ownership turns even sand into gold. So if if in the even more than the giving the security, if the tenants are given that ownership rights, then the tenants will, the cultivator will work more and more enthusiastically, isn't it? So this is the ultimate solution. Sorry. So ownership rights is the ultimate land reform measure. That is a final objective of introducing the land reform. But unfortunately, only some state governments have implemented this program, giving the ownership rights to tenants. But majority of the states, they did not take it. They haven't taken it seriously. And on the top of it, with the introduction of economic reforms, this has been sidelined. Okay, so these were all the reforms introduced for the tenants. Still, three more measures are there, land reform measures are there, which I will explain to you in my next class. Okay, so if you find this video useful, please like, share and subscribe. So until my next class, next video, take care. Bye bye.